Welcome back, students. What we're going to go through now is, having gone through all of the historical context and some of the theoretical ideas, we're now actually going to dive into Heart of Darkness itself and discuss a couple of the techniques that are used in the text and how they are engaged with. So, firstly, I want to talk about something that is called narrative framing. Now, this is going to be something you use from now all the way till the end of third year. So this is something to get used to and get comfortable with. So what I want you to think of when we talk about a framed narrative is how a text can be framed within a story. So how a story can exist within another story. So I put up a little image of what is called a babushka or a matryoshka doll, and it's a Russian toy. But the idea here is, as you can quite see, there's one little story and another little story and another little story and another little story and another little story. Obviously, we're not going to be dealing that much with so many narratives in this book, but I do want you to think about how there is a secondary narrative to this text. So we have the first narrative of Marlow in Africa hunting down and finding Kurtz and his engagements with the people in Africa and in Central Africa. But what we also have is we have the story of this nameless seaman who is one of Marlow's sort of seamates, who is on a ship called the Nelly on the Thames, who is listening to Marlow retell him the story. And he's hearing the story and he's retelling it and writing it down for us as the audience. So there are two stories, one enveloped in another. So a little bit of an illustration here, just so you guys can understand exactly what I mean by that. So you have Marlow and Kurtz in Central Africa, and this is retold to us by the crewman on the Nelly who is listening to Marlow retell his adventures. What this allows us to do is, and what is the point of framing? The most important thing that it allows us to do is it allows us to go, okay, we have somebody who's telling us the story who heard it from Marlow. And what this does is, instead of us just immediately going and trusting Marlow, it allows us to go, okay, do we trust Marlow? It allows us to have what we call a critical lens that is looking at Marlow through the view or the eyes of this other crewmate of his and go, okay, do I trust him? And this layer of criticism makes us critical of everything Marlow tells us. It makes us go, do I trust everything you're saying? And is everything you're saying valid? And more importantly than that, is everything that you're saying trustworthy, and can I believe everything that you're saying? Or are you trying to make yourself look better? Or are you reliving this for your own enjoyment's sake? So something allows us to do is it allows us to critique the themes that Marlow is raising. And it makes us go, okay, I'm seeing this, but I'm seeing this through Marlow's eyes and then through someone else's eyes. Do I trust it? Do I trust you as a reliable narrator? So one of the things that I want you to think about here, and this is a description taken directly from the text, is the description that our narrator gives of Marlow himself. And it's really important to look at the way that he is described, because this should make us realize a lot about Marlow's character without even having to get to know him very well. So I'm going to read it to you guys, and I want you to let it sort of simmer in your mind. And this also, said Marlow suddenly, has been one of the darkest places of earth. He was the only man of us who still followed the sea. The worst that could be said of him was that he did not represent his class. He was a seaman, but he was a wanderer too. While most seamen led, if one may so express it, a sedentary life, their minds are of the stay-at-home order, and their home is always with them, the ship, and so is their country, the sea. One ship is very much like another, and the sea is always the same. In the immutability of their surroundings, the foreign shores, the foreign faces, the changing immensity of life glide past, veiled not by a sense of mystery, but by a slightly disdainful ignorance. There is nothing mysterious to a seaman unless it be the sea itself, which is the mistress of his existence and as inscrutable as destiny. So what we're starting with here, the first thing that we're starting with is that he is being compared to other seamen. And unlike his colleagues and his crewmates, he himself, the figure of Marlow, instead of just being a character who straightforwardly is a normal sea mate who goes on the sea and is always has the commitment to the sea. What he is he's an adventurer. He is more interested in more than just being on the sea and with his crewmates and on the boat. What he's interested in is the foreign faces, foreign lands, different cultures. He wants to engage with people who are not the same as himself. So, for the rest, after his hours of work, a casual stroll or a casual spree on the shores suffices to unfold for him the secret of a whole continent, and generally he finds the secret not worth knowing. The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlow was not typical. If his propensity to spin yarns be accepted, and to him the meaning of an episode was not the inside of it like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze, in the likeness of these misty halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illumination of moonshine. So something that we are being told here is that the way that Marlow tells stories is different. His idea is not just the simple moral of the story that's in the middle of a cracked nut. What's important to him is the outside of the nut. How we tell the story is just as important as what the story is trying to tell us. Which, if you have watched anything about modernism and you engage with any of the earlier slides, something to keep in mind for third year is that's exactly what modernists are obsessed with. They're not just obsessed with the story, but how the story is told. So what I want you to do now is, this is an activity, and I'd like you to do it in groups because obviously 5 brains or 6 brains is better than none, better than 1. So I've given you 3 questions about the exact extract. So you can go back and look at the extract that I put on the slide before now, and you can read through it and engage with the ideas that I've portrayed there. So it's always good to take a listen to what I've just analyzed very briefly there. So the first thing is, what do you think is the narrator's opinion of Marlow, and provide evidence for this? What does the capitalization of the word destiny imply? And think back to your Romantic and Renaissance poems that you did in first year. And then the following quotation represents both the analysis of Marlow and the story from the anonymous crewman. The yarns of the seaman have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. So I want you to break this down. What does the quote suggest about Marlow according to the narrator? Explain the metaphor being used here. What things are being compared? And what does this suggest to the reader? And what does the quote imply about the storytelling traditions of seamen? And how does it suggest that this narrative will be different? Okay, this is meant to be challenging. I have given and provided some general answers to your lecturers, so go take a look at those and you should get a general idea of where I'd like you to go in your brains. So, having talked about having talked about narrative framing, let's talk about mirroring. And I absolutely hate this word. I'm never going to get it right. So, let's try. Mirroring is the technique in literature where characters have similar characteristics and they are intentionally meant to be put against one another. And usually what we have is 2 characters that are similar to one another, and we are seeing the faults or the problematic characteristics that each side of them highlights. Sometimes what you will see is one character will be intentionally highlighted positively, but usually we are looking for the negative characteristics. And a lot of the time what you'll have is you'll have a character that's similar to your protagonist and highlights the negative actions that the protagonist has done that you may not have realized. Things you may not have thought, oh, that's a problem, you shouldn't have done that. Something that may have happened that you didn't even realize might have been problematic, but the mirror of this other character represents the actions taken. And a good person or an author who does this, but though very unintentionally, a lot of the time is Jane Austen. If you look at Jane Austen, there's always a group of very similarly wealthy white people. And if you compare them, you'll often see there will be 2 sisters, and you will have these 2 sisters being compared constantly. And you see the negative aspect of the one usually shining through, and we tend to follow and be more interested in the problematic sister. So, one of the things that you need to keep in mind is who is being mirrored and why are they being mirrored. So I'm going to take a very simple example of the mirroring technique in these texts, and I'm going to be comparing the mistress and the intended. So both of these women have a relationship with Kurtz. Some arguably one is just of a purely sexual nature, which is the mistress, and the second being a legitimized proposal, which is the intended. Obviously, you can immediately look at them, and I've chosen some fan art here to give you some ideas, but you can see exactly the differences between them. And you can probably just from the imagery tell exactly what I'm going to talk about in terms of how different they are. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that these women are not named, and therefore we can sort of strip away their individual identity, which means they are not here on the simple level of what they represent, or rather who they are, but rather what they represent. So we're going to read through the description of the mistress, who I think by far is probably my favorite character, because she is so much more interesting than everyone else. But something to think about here is how is she described and what do you think she represents? So, dark human shapes could be made out in the distance, flitting indistinctly against the gloomy border of the forest. And near the river, two bronze figures, leaning on tall spears, stood in the sunlight, under the fantastic headdresses of spotted skins, warlike, and still in statuesque repose. And from right to left along the lighted shore moved a wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman. She walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed cloths, treading the earth proudly, with a slight jingle and flash of barbarous ornaments. She carried her head high. Her hair was done in the shape of a helmet, and she had brass leggings to the knee, wire brass gauntlets to the elbow, a crimson spot on her tawny cheek, innumerable necklaces of glass beads on her neck, bizarre things, charms of gifts of witchmen that hung about her, glittered and trembled at every step. She must have had the value of several elephant tusks upon her. She was savage and superb, wide-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress. And in the hush that had fallen suddenly on the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of the fecund and mysterious life, seemed to look at her, pensive, as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. So, on a very simplistic level, the first thing we need to note is that this is the first time a character, besides one of the male characters who is dressed so immaculately called the accountant, it's the first time we have a thorough description of anyone. She is described in a huge amount of detail, which is very unusual. And obviously we have the hugely problematic description of her as a barbarous and savage character. And you can see the inherent racism and the perceptions that come with her. And you can see also the exoticization. And what I mean by that is because she's so exotic, because she's so other, there is something considered beautiful about her rather than the fact that she might have some natural form of beauty herself. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind here is this last section. And something to keep in mind, very importantly, is that the mistress is meant to represent Africa as a whole. She is meant to be the physical, characterized manifestation of Africa, and therefore she is meant to be the mirror against which we compare the intended. She is the mirror against which we are going to see the other female character. Now, if she is representing the whole of Africa, she is also the representation of the entire civilization. She's there to make us go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You are a completely different version of identity than I've ever thought of. And you are completely different from any forms of femininity and identity that we have come across in the text before now. So let's look at the intended by contrast and how she is described. Now, this isn't specifically fan art of her, but this is a Victorian woman wearing mourning outfits. Kurtz has died at this point. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read that. And she is wearing mourning, which is black. So these are two separate quotes of her. Thus I was left with a slim packet of letter and the girl's portrait. She struck me as beautiful. I mean, she had a beautiful expression. I know that the sunlight can be made to lie too, yet one felt that no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed the delicate shade of truthfulness upon those features. She seemed ready to listen without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought of herself. I concluded I would go and give her back her portrait and those letters myself. Curiosity? Yes, and also some other feeling perhaps. So the first description we have of her is just of a portrait of her that he has, a portrait of what he considers to be a beautiful girl. The second description we have is when he actually meets her. She came forward all in black, with a pale head floating towards me in dusk. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death, more than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she would remember and mourn forever. She took both my hands in hers and murmured, "I heard you weeping." I noticed she was not very young. I mean not girlish. She had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. Now, if we're comparing that, if we think about how the Mistress is a manifestation and an image of Africa, what is the intended an image of? She is not described physically, and that is something to keep in mind. She is described briefly physically, and one of the things that we do get described weirdly quite a lot is her forehead, which is supposed to be very white and clean. And a forehead, if you know anything about the ideas that your physical features can represent parts of who you are as a person, the forehead is meant to represent intelligence and knowledge. So one of the ideas that we have here often is that her large forehead might suggest that she has lots of knowledge and lots of information tucked away somewhere. But the most important thing that we get here is that she's not described as beautiful in the same sort of statuesque and astonishing richness that we have with the Mistress. But by contrast, we have this sense of mourning and tragedy, and we have this sense of mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. And what we have here is a manifestation of European society, but womanhood in European society. The sort of sense, and the word I'm going to use here is very specific, forbearance. Therefore, there will be, I will tolerate, I can endure, I can survive. And this is much of what the sort of womanhood in Europe at this point in time had been doing. The suffragette movement hadn't really come into being yet. Well, it was starting to build. And mostly what we have here is this image of this sort of innocent, trustworthy woman who is honor bound to worship and believe in the man that she has decided to marry. And by contrast, we're supposed to look at her need for dependence and codependence on Kurtz's identity by contrast to the Mistress's fierce independence and strength and virility and fertileness. Whereas we were supposed to get a sense of, although this is intellectual as a woman, she is obviously educated and intelligent, she might also be incredibly boring and dull and lacking in interest. So you're meant to compare these two female characters and how these two female characters are an extension of the societies that they have come from. So, I've actually just done exactly that. And something to think about here is just a little hint, is that our Mistress, or the description of the Mistress, a lot of the time is described through richness of goods and material things, just like Africa is. She is referred to as something with many possessions, many things that others could want. Whereas the intended is not described in her physical sense at all, but rather by her mental appeal, her appeal for belief, for suffering, for fidelity, for trust, and all of these things. So one of the things that I want to just talk about briefly is how the characters relate to one another, because these are not the only mirrors. There are many other mirrors in the narrative. And I've talked about two of them that I think are some of the most stark, but there are many other mirrors between characters here. Marlow and Kurtz easily could mirror one another. The accountant and Marlow can be representations of one another. The Harlequin and Marlow are probably the most startling comparison that you're going to find, because Marlow does not want to admit that he is a lot like the Harlequin. And then what you can have is you can have a comparison between the manager and Kurtz as well, though that is obviously less obvious. So what I want you to do as another activity is I want you to discuss which characters might mirror one another and how they represent characteristics that might be mirrored in one another, and whether they are negative and positive reflections of one another. And something that I want you to think about importantly here is that consider the moral characters that each of these characters have, And why, except for Kurtz and Marlow, is everyone nameless? Why is it so important that no one has a name? I want you to think specifically here. This is an image of Kurtz, and it's one of the most traditional paintings of him. Why is he one of the only characters that has a name? And what is the idea of having a name? Why is it so important? Okay, last section we're going to talk about is metaphors in Hearts of Darkness and the deliberate metaphors that are present consistently through this text. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Ivory, the Congo River, the Rivets, and then we're not going to talk about darkness because that is going to be learning outcome 2.3, and then we're briefly going to mention Kurtz's painting. So let's first start with Ivory and what Ivory represents. So the first thing that we think about Ivory is Ivory was considered to be like spices from India. It was considered to be the ultimate luxury good. And it represented natural purity. And I mean, if you look at the color of ivory, this is obviously cleaned ivory, but nonetheless, the ivory is also the name of the color. It's meant to represent this warm, clear, pure whiteness. And it's usually almost always used as an image of purity. However, something that's always come with it, and particularly in modern imagery, is that although it might be pure itself, it is tainted through the procedure through which it is attained, which is almost always violence. But it also represents economic success and freedom for anybody who can get access to it at this point in time. A lot like Moby Dick and the whales, the good itself represents freedom and economic success and the source of opportunity, but the way it is attained is almost always through violence and pain and tragedy. So something that you should also remember is that a lot of the way that they would get ivory in Africa at this point in time is they weren't just going out and killing elephants. There was a lot of elephants that had died, and ivory is preserved fairly well underground, so it was buried. So what they were doing at this point is they were actually digging up the skeletons of these huge animals, and they were then sawing off the ivory. I've got a description here of ivory, which is so poignant and links back to this. And it says, the word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was sighed. You would think they were praying to it. That a taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whiff from some corpse. By Jove, I've never seen anything so unreal in my life. And outside the silent wilderness, surrounding this clear speck on the earth, struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion. So think about how unbelievably powerful the image of ivory is at this point in time, and what it represents to the men, and how desperate they are for it. The next is the Congo River. We talked about the rivers before already when we were going through the Chinua Achebe reading, so this shouldn't be unfamiliar to you. But it is definitely a very familiar image in terms of how it represents danger and opportunity, and how you cannot have one without the other, because you can never have opportunity in Africa without danger. Remember, this is a very colonial perspective, but this is the quote that I think usually personifies it. Hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they had all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? And that's exactly what this is the river is the transportation. It is the way through to greatness. It is the opportunity, the opening of a door. We're going to talk about the rivets now as the last thing that I'm going to explain to you, which is very important because the rivets are a surprising little image that we get in the book. And the rivets are these little weird metal pieces. And Marlow is demanding rivets from the manager, and he's saying, I cannot sail the ship or sail my little steamboat without rivets to put it back together. And what they do is they hold sheets of metal together, and they're ideal for doing anything in extreme pressures like underwater or in space. So they're very important, and they are a symbol of holding things together and tying one thing to another. And they become quite a bone of contention between Marlow and the manager, because the manager absolutely refuses to spend any more to get these rivets. And Marlow desperately needs them. And at one point, it's quite funny because he thinks he wins. But he's thwarted by the arrival of a bunch of they're called pilgrimage or pilgrims. But he's thwarted because the manager somehow manages to sneak around him and not give them to him. And one of the things that generally is perceived to be the general understanding of what the rivets represent the holding together of Western society's morals and standards at this point. Because without them, without this sort of bar to set and hold things together, you're going to just disintegrate further and further and further, exactly as Kurtz has done. So finally, I want you to do this activity. This is a description of Kurtz's painting, which I've given you a little artistic representation of. This is, I think, one of the most effective ones I could find. And this is a representation of what Kurtz has drawn. So this is the description we get. It's very brief, but it's quite an important metaphor for Kurtz himself. I rose, then I noticed a small sketch in oils on a panel, representing a woman draped and blindfolded, carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on that face was sinister. It arrested me, and he stood by civilly, holding a half-empty pint champagne bottle, medical comforts, with the candle stuck in it. To my question, he said Mr. Kurtz had painted it, in this very station more than a year ago, while waiting for means to go to his trading post. Tell me, pray, said I, who is this Mr. Kurtz? So I have two questions for you. I'm not going to tell you the answers because I want you to think of it yourself. The first is, what do you think this is a representation of? Who is this? And it should be quite obvious. And the second is what does this tell us about Kurtz? This is not a traditional representation of this character or this figure at all. This is a very unusual representation. So what does it tell us about Kurtz? That she is being portrayed like this. And for your next learning outcome, I want you to read The Post-Colonial Analysis of Conrad's Heart of Darkness by Sam Govan, and we will go through that in the next lecture. So I know there's lots of activities in this section, but you'll manage just fine, and good luck.